Into the fantasy football season. Here's a few defenses I would drop this week. The first one, the Indianapolis Colts. So the Colts, they were a good 2-week use with good matchups versus the New York Jets and the Jacksonville Jaguars in the last couple weeks. But now they versus the Buffalo Bills and Tampa Bay Bucks in the next 2 weeks. So obviously I'm not going to use this Colt defense the next 2 weeks as a fantasy owner. So right here I would drop them. And then they got a good matchup in week 13 versus Houston and then go on bye. So the next 3 out of 4 weeks, they're not going to be usable in my opinion. They gave you some decent games the last 2, like I mentioned, versus those weaker offenses. But right now, they're an easy drop, in my opinion, is Indianapolis. I know as a unit, they're pretty decent this year. But with those tough matchups and better defenses available on the wire on matchups, I would definitely drop the Colts this week. There's no reason to stash 2 defenses, in my opinion, especially with Indianapolis not being usable, like I mentioned, in the last 3 out of 4 weeks. The next defense I would drop this week's the Baltimore Ravens. So the Ravens, they had a cupcake matchup at the Miami Dolphins, and they didn't come through in that ball game. 16 points allowed and 4 sacks in that one. And week 9 versus Minnesota as well, 31 points allowed. Week 11, I know it's a good matchup at the Chicago Bears, but the Bears actually have moved the football pretty well over the last 2 games for them, including that Monday Night Football game where they lost in a tough one at the Pittsburgh Steelers in week 9. So right now, Baltimore, they've been a bad defense pretty much the whole season. I know injuries on the defense have been a big part of it, no doubt about it, for this Raven team. But right now, I just can't trust them. They're not getting to the quarterback. They're not getting big play turnovers like we're used to seeing over the last few seasons. And right now, they're just not getting the job done. So right here, I know it's a decent matchup at Chicago, like I mentioned, but they're a defense I can't trust. And they're owned in way too many fantasy leagues as well at 80%. And I would drop this week's the Pittsburgh Steelers. So the Steelers, I thought they were going to have 2 great games, but that really didn't come to fruition in Week 9 and Week 10 with cupcake matchups versus the Bears, where they gave up 21 points, 3 sacks, and an intho and a fumble recovery. Week 10 at Detroit versus Detroit, 16 points allowed and 4 sacks. So right now, Week 11, a tough matchup at the Los Angeles Chargers that give up the 11th least amount of fantasy points to defenses. We know this Charger offense is high-powered with Austin Eckler, Justin Herbert, Keenan Allen, and Mike Williams. And right now, they're just not getting the job done as Pittsburgh. They had 2 great matchups and didn't have much to show for it as far as fantasy football goes. So right now, with the Chargers, Cincinnati, and Baltimore coming up in the next 3, their defense I could shy away from. I know the Steelers get stronger, like I've mentioned, as the season goes on. But right now, I just don't see them doing much, especially with 2 mediocre ball games the last few weeks. So that's a few defenses I would drop here for Week 11 of the fantasy football season.